Hey, what's happening, friends? Jazz trumpeter Bobby Spellman here to welcome you to a little bonus episode in our jazz improvisation series. In the first episode in our series, I discussed the C major scale and the way that you can construct the various seventh chords and corresponding modes associated with that scale. Now, before we dive into the way that you can use these various modes in order to navigate some of the most common chord progressions in jazz, I wanted to take a little time to just give you an alternative perspective from which you can view the various modes of the major scale. So let's dive in on this little bonus episode of
Theory with Bob.
All right, in the first episode of our jazz improvisation series, I did a rapid-fire overview of the 7 seventh chords and corresponding modes typically associated with the C major scale. Now, I wanted to start with this way of viewing these various modes because as we get into the process of navigating smaller chord progressions that make up our favorite jazz standards, I thought it would be useful to be able to see all of these chords and modes as they relate to a greater tonic key. So that's helpful not only when you're dealing with the key of an entire piece, but also the key of a smaller chord progression. Now let me give you an example of where this can be very useful. Let's say we take, for example, the first 4 measures of the classic Jerome Kern standard, All the Things You Are. Now the first chord in that chord progression is an F minor 7, which then goes to a B flat minor 7, which then goes to an E flat 7 and resolves to an A flat major 7 chord. If you're only looking at the structure of all of those chords, it won't necessarily tell you much about what scales you might use or what modes you might use to improvise in that context. But if you can think of the first chord, the F minor 7 chord, as being the 6th chord of the A flat major tonic that we are resolving to in the first 4 measures, that gives you a little hint that you might want to use the Aeolian mode rather than the Dorian mode on that chord. Now, as we go along in the series, it will become apparent to you that as an artist, you have many choices of what you might choose to play over these various chords, and I'm very in favor of trying to figure out different approaches to playing various modes over chords. So we'll talk about the varying possibilities within those contexts, but it's useful to be able to look at that chord progression as a 6-2-5-1 in the key of A flat major. However, there is another way that I like to think about the modes, and I just wanted to give you this perspective because this tends to be the way that I think about these. And this is more helpful if you're dealing with various chords and chord progressions that are not obviously related to any one key. All right, so if we're thinking about all of the chords in C major, all of the modes in C major as being C Ionian, D Dorian, E Phrygian, F Lydian, G Mixolydian, A Aeolian, B Locrian, and back to C Ionian again, that is a way of thinking about all of these modes as being relative to the key at hand, which in the case of the last video was C major. However, you can also think of each of these modes as being as parallel to their root note. So in this case, rather than going through all of the modes in a particular key, I will switch keys depending on what mode we're talking about. So let me give you an example that I think will be illustrative of what I'm talking about and the way that I tend to think about these various modes. Let's say we come back to the C major scale. Now I'm going to construct all 7 modes based on C as the root note, okay? So rather than thinking about the 7 modes of C major, now we're gonna stick to C as the root and we're gonna change the notes based on that C in order to illustrate the 7 modes that we discussed in episode 1, all right? So the first thing I'm gonna do is add an F sharp to the scale, and that gives us the C Lydian mode. So if you take that C major scale and you add a sharp 4, also known as the sharp 11, that gives us the Lydian sound. All right, let's return that F sharp back to F again. Now that gives us the classic C major scale. Now, if I add 1 flat to that scale, that will give me the C Mixolydian mode. So that's going to be a flat 7 is the distinguishing sound of the Mixolydian mode. All right, now if I add 2 flats to the mix and I bring the 3rd down, that gives us the C Dorian mode, which includes a minor third and a minor seventh in the structure of the mode. If we add one more flat to the mix, and we include the flat 6 to the scale, that gives us the Aeolian mode, also known as natural minor. If we add another flat to the mix and we bring the second degree of the scale down a half step, that'll give us a flat 2, flat 3, natural 4, perfect fourth, we'll call it, 5th, minor 6th, minor 7th, back to the root again. That gives us the Phrygian mode. All right, so if you got a flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 1, that's the Phrygian mode. If we add one more flat and we come up with a diminished fifth here, now we have 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, flat 6, flat 7, and back to 1 again. That gives us the Locrian mode. So I'm just giving you a quick overview of another way to think about it. Instead of thinking about all of these modes as being related to a major key, you can also think about the structure of these modes as related to a tonic pitch to the root note of whatever these various modes are. Now, the value of thinking about it like that is that if you're dealing with a piece of music in which there is not a clear key of the moment or key of the piece. This often comes up in pieces from the 60s where we sort of abandon what we might call functional harmony in favor of a more modal approach. It will be helpful to think of these various modes as related to a root note. Now, this is also helpful when you start getting into other modes that may not be directly related to a key. So, for example, one of my favorite modes is the Phrygian dominant mode. So if we start with C as the root, that gives us C. That gives us a flat 2, natural 3, 4, 5th, flat 6, flat 7, 1. It's easy to think of that in terms of the relationship of all the notes to the root rather than necessarily being the 5th mode of harmonic minor, of A harmonic minor. In fact, if you're dealing, you may often deal with pieces in which these modes are the tonic, in a sense. Like these modes may be just the main chord in more of a modal tune. I can think of many examples of that, but we'll get to that later. And if you're thinking about the structure of the mode as relating to that root, then you don't have to do two calculations. You don't have to do two moves where you go, what's the 5th mode? All right, this is the harmonic minor mode, but it's the 5th mode, so therefore we're in A, but we're not really in A, we're in whatever it happens to be in this case. What are we doing? The C. So we're in F harmonic minor. I might have messed that up earlier. Oh well. Casual episode. We're getting through it. There's a lot going on here. Instead of thinking, where is this resolving to, you can just think, all right, Phrygian dominant, flat 2, natural 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, 1. All right, so very often the way that I think about these modes is as related to a root rather than as a part of a larger key. And this helps when I'm navigating tunes that are more modal in nature or sections of tunes that may not obviously relate to a major key. But that will come in handy more later on in the series. And for now, we're going to be talking mostly about diatonic chord progressions, which means chord progressions that deal with a particular key. All right, gang, I hope that helps. One thing that's very important to me as a teacher is that different people find it easy to think about things in different ways. I'm very into the idea that everybody has a different way of thinking about these things. So if one perspective works well for somebody and another perspective works well for somebody else, stick with what works for you. All right. So I tend to think more in terms of the parallel relationships of the modes to a root note. But if you find it easier to think of translate these various modes from their relative major key, that's useful. I think it's also really important to be able to think about these things in both ways, to be able to understand that each of these modes may relate in a particular way to a greater key, but also that they relate to a particular root in a structure, with one of these kinds of structures. All right, gang? So I hope that helps just shed a little bit of additional light on ways that you might think about the various modes of the major scale. And as we go forward, I will show you a little bit more about the way that you can navigate these various modes in order to be able to improvise over some of your favorite jazz standards. All right, gang, if you like this video, give us a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you are looking for lessons in jazz improvisation or various instruments, including the brass instruments, woodwind instruments, guitar, piano, etc., you can find us on our website at www.ridgewoodschoolofmusic.com, or you can send us an email at ridgewoodschoolofmusic@gmail.com, and we will set you up with a great teacher for what you're looking for. All right, gang, happy practicing, have fun with this, and we'll catch you on the next episode. See ya.